Welcome to episode 57 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Today, you just got me. I actually just got done trying to record episode 57 with Kurt and Jerry, but we had really bad technical issues where both Kurt and I's voice had an annoying level of feedback or gargle to it. And Kurt had to run off to a meeting right when we were done. So we were left with something that I did not feel comfortable sending out to our listeners. You can tell if you've listened to the podcast, producing podcasts is not my first area of expertise, but I am dedicated to putting out, and Kurt and Jerry as well, a quality product for you that we're proud of. And I just couldn't stomach putting what we were talking about out. And I'm not ready to give up on our 56, going on 57 week stretch of putting out new content every week. So I want to do a mini episode with just me. And one of the reasons why it's just me as well is that I'm in a crazy stretch of travel where I'm hardly ever not training over the last 2 weeks. And then I'm in Atlanta and Southern Colorado next week as well. So I think in a 6 week span, I'm in like 9 or 10 cities. I think every time zone I've covered. So I didn't have the flexibility really to reschedule and redo this. But I wanted to introduce the topic in hopes that next week for episode 58, we can bring Jerry and Kurt back into the conversation and get their thoughts. Because we did have a great conversation until the quality just got so terrible. We had to scrap it. So the title for the episode is The Role of Staff Supervision in Your Trauma-Informed Journey. And this came out of a lot of thinking I've been doing recently and my conversations and trainings around creating trauma-informed workplaces and also really on self-care as well. And it's the role of structured strategic supervision. And when I use the word supervision, I believe I need to define that because it means different things in different settings. To me, supervision is a strategic space of time on a weekly or bi-weekly, though I think ideally it would be a weekly basis, where a supervisor and a person that they supervise meet to talk about how the supervisee is doing, what challenges they might have, talking about cases, maybe issues with the team, performance issues, but a really proactive relational time where two people sit together and talk about professional development, wellness, and sort of the person's goals moving forward. And so in the mental health and the social work arenas, this is a pretty traditional approach. I grew up, professionally in the child welfare, highly dominated by mental health thinking in many of the organizations I went to. And I was lucky enough to have usually an hour of structured supervision each and every week. And if I look back at how I grew as a professional, it's within those hour periods where I could bring my struggles. I could bring my, whether it was struggles of how to approach cases or really whether it was just maybe some burnout I was having or those sort of things to somebody who I look to as a expert. And to have that time to develop, it was just priceless for me. I also think it's interesting as I've researched best practices. One that stands out that I researched a while back was functional family therapy. You look at the requirements for these best practices in the mental health arena, and they usually require an extraordinary amount of supervision, not just a lot of times the 1 hour a week. When I looked at helping settings integrate some of these best practices that already had the hour a week, they struggled with how could we afford to do even a more enriched supervision. I always wondered and out loud at times how much of the improved outcomes were just because of additional supervision and support, and how many were the skills that we were learning. And I'm sure it's a mix of both. But I think that the richer supervision environment plays a big role in that. So when we talk about supervision, why this topic I think has really come to the forefront of my mind is that while in the mental health arena, I was lucky enough to get a great deal of support and supervision early on in my career, and then really moving forward as well. And I've done a lot of trainings recently with folks in education and folks in medical services, clinic settings. And I think about the challenges of being a therapist, mental health worker, and those are great. I especially working with traumatized populations, you hear stories consistently of abuse, calls to child protective services, worried about things like suicides, overdoses. I mean, there's a lot of intensity there. But, when I think about the intensity experienced by professions like nursing, teachers, paraprofessionals, teachers' assistants at schools, front desk folks, I think in a lot of ways, those jobs are just as intense, and in some situations more intense than my work as a therapist. Being married to a first grade teacher and doing a lot of work in education, elementary school teachers especially spend a huge amount of time with their students, and when their students are going through trauma, I think that's at least comparable to the intensity that I felt as a therapist. If not, I'd argue more so. I know a lot of nurses in the healthcare for the homeless system and federally qualified health centers deal with a lot of trauma, and oftentimes where I had an hour a week to work with folks, they sometimes just get small glimpses into that. Hopefully they can refer, but not everybody's ready to go to get services. So there's so much intensity, I'd say, for the listeners of this podcast around our work, that what I'm worried about and the conclusion that I'm coming to, and what I hope to really throw out to Jerry and Kurt for the next episode is, can we really be trauma informed? And I always just like to put out there, I see becoming trauma informed as more of a journey than an end point. But if we use that language of becoming trauma informed, can you do that if you're providing services to individuals experiencing trauma? Can you do that without structured individual supervision? And I don't care if you're like an MD, because I've seen a lot of really burned out physicians. I'm not going to say they're the most burned out profession I've seen, but I've seen a lot of burnout physicians. I just don't think because you have 8 or 9 years of education behind your belt that isolates you or insulates you from things like vicarious and secondary trauma, where we now have good evidence, both diagnostic and brain scan evidence, that trauma can be transferred from working with traumatized populations to us as an empathetic, compassionate helper. So I don't see, and I worry about my physician friends as well, because sometimes I think there's just the process of going through medical school and all that wear and tear and the long shifts that people do through that experience doesn't set you up in a good, healthy way to start your career to begin with. And that mentality might lead to even higher levels of burnout. And the statistics play that out. If you look at public health nurses, medical providers, teachers, social workers, we're all pretty much dominate the top 10 occupations that are at risk for burnout. And so when I think about structured supervision, I'm really thinking about a dedicated time. I really think it needs to be once a week for at least 30 minutes. If you want to argue with me that it's bi-weekly, every other week, if you go from 0 to that, you get 2 thumbs up for me. But why, as if I go back to my role as a former supervisor, why did I want that? Why did I, even in environments I went into, because I've overseen educational programs, why did I make it work and find the time to supervise folks? Is that I knew this work could overwhelm them, and it should overwhelm each and every one of us at some point, with the amount of intensities, both from a psychological perspective of everything we're going through, and also just a cognitive problem-solving perspective. And what I really wanted to do was make sure that everyone that I supervised was healthy. And as my career sort of progressed, I supervised the people that were supervising. I really wanted to make sure those folks were healthy because I know their health would determine the health of those that they supervise. So even for folks not doing direct care, I thought this was critically important because I wanted all my folks to have a self-care plan, which I don't think exists in a lot of environments either, of how are you going to take care of yourself, both inside the work environment. How do you know your triggers that you might be experiencing, compassion fatigue, burnout, those sort of things. How can we support you in the environment to stay as healthy as possible, but also what are you doing outside the work environment to stay healthy? And I wanted to check up on that on a regular basis. Now, I may, depending on the person, might not check on it every week, but at least it was an every other week sort of how are you doing sort of check-in thing about how they were doing on their self-care plan. The other piece of supervision that I couldn't live without as a supervisor was I wanted people to be working on improving themselves professionally. I'm really sick of the model where you, during your performance evaluation, you set a couple of goals for yourself, and then you don't really think about those until the next employee performance evaluation. Sometimes that could be 3 months. Sometimes I've seen that as long as 12 months. Setting goals and not checking up on them and supporting staff and achieving those goals is not effective supervision, in my opinion. So I wanted to also, besides the wellness piece and besides their own health, I also really felt I needed to help, sometimes give them a little push, but a lot of times it's just how can I support you in your professional development, and talking about how some of their new skills applied to their works with clients, patients, or students that they have. The other thing with supervision that I think is absolutely critical is a proactive approach to leadership. I've yet to meet a professional who says, I have a closed door policy. Everybody has an open door policy, and that's good. Don't close your door and lock it. But what I really worry about with that, and what I've seen in my work and in talking to leaders, is when you have an open door policy, problems walk through your door. There's already something gone wrong in some way, shape, or form. So one of the things that, while an open door policy is great because I want to know what's going on, especially if there's issues going on in the workplace, I found that if I'm meeting with people on a regular basis for supervision, I can proactively address a lot of smaller issues before they walk into my open door. And so an open door policy is good for that reactive piece, but doesn't do a whole heck of a lot to be proactive. I didn't see people in some of the initial kind of exhaustion phases of burnout walk into my open door and say, hey, I'm really struggling. I'm not bad right now, but I just need a little support because I'm starting to feel exhausted. So I dealt with a lot less problems. And this is where I would argue that supervision is a time-effective approach to leadership, because I think the biggest barrier for most places that don't traditionally have trauma-informed supervision or any kind of structured supervision is, well, where do we find the time to do this? It takes a little bit of investment up front. I will acknowledge that, but I really believe that this saved me time. So this became efficient for me because I knew what was going on. I could help proactively instead of reactively. And when I did that, I had a much healthier environment, created a much better workplace for those that were working for me. The other thing with the proactivity that I think is critical, and I'm just going to use schools as an example here, is a lot of times the supervisory experience for many teachers is that the principal comes in the classroom once a year, maybe twice a year. There might be a little bit more if it's a new teacher, and observes the teacher in the classroom teaching, and then gives feedback on that one or two lessons they see. First off, let's just say that's ridiculous. I think that most principals and most teachers would agree with me that that's a ridiculous way to supervise somebody, because you don't know which kid might have a bad day. Maybe the one of the kids that always disrupts class isn't there that day. I mean, so it could go either way. There's luck of the draw. Is there a fire drill? I mean, all these things can play in to it. And one of the things I see with working with educators is I hear hard stories. I hear stories of teachers knowing that kids might be being abused at home. There's stories I hear of, parents passing away, of addiction in the home and how that's affecting their students. And when this happens, when real trauma sometimes, when students, I hear it pass away, or maybe the school has had 3 or 4 kids and still has a couple, and the mom or dad die of cancer or something like that. I mean, these are in many ways real traumas for teachers. And if I don't have a relationship built up with my principal or vice principal, depending on the structure, the level of support that person can offer during the then crisis is fairly limited. I think a great principal could do that okay. But oftentimes then the crises happen, and we see trauma often plays out over time. So it's not just a one-time off meeting. It's helping somebody through a traumatic experience. And some of that's supervisory. Some of that might be referring them to an employee assistance program sort of thing. But where does that support come from? And what I see too often, again, if it's just an average principal, who I think we set those folks up for failure, and I always try to think about what the average person would need to succeed, is without any trust building, with any proactivity, without that strong relationship and sort of that as Jerry said in our deleted episode here, that kind of sacred ritual and space to connect every week on a personal basis. I think the support anybody can provide is somewhat limited. Now, again, a great principal might be the exception to that rule, but I think when we think structurally of a trauma-informed environment, I don't know how we help teachers stay healthy, avoid burnout, without some of that more effective strategic approaches. I see this in health clinics as well, where a lot of times there's sort of a very kind of flat supervisory structure where one person may supervise a whole lot of people going on. I've seen that in the upwards of, ridiculously in some ways, like 100 people are technically supervised by one person. And you've got a lot of trauma going on, people passing away, abuse being disclosed, and where's the support coming from? Also, how are you helping people develop professionally? And so I think one of the biggest challenges, I don't think we talk nearly enough about this, because it is a challenge both on the structural level, the skill set level, because I think especially in the helping professions, and I would say I see this in the medical professions and education as well, we don't always give leaders training on how to be reflective supervisors, how to really promote trust and safety. And again, I always like to maximize productivity and effectiveness there as well. So I think that there's a lagging skill set sometimes, especially when we set, hey, you're supervising, 40 people. You obviously, if you're supervising 40 people, you're not going to be mean with everybody effectively. I think that structure in and of itself, I could question of whether that's trauma informed. And I would love to measure burnout in low supervisory structures In other words, that a supervisor has a high level of, or a high number of people they're supervising versus a more strategic, structured mental health sort of framework for supervision. And again, my argument is not only would it save time, but it also drastically improves quality. If I can brainstorm tough cases with you, I know I'm probably better likely to make a decision. And so I really think that to start to think about this in a different way could really help us improve quality of services. And again, I think there's some efficiency gains, at least in my experience as well. And so the final piece I want to talk here with the supervision piece, and again, we'll follow this up with our normal crew talking about it as well, is really some people say, well, we have team supervision, and is that enough? And I think that's a good, really legitimate question. And I think that there's team supervision is great, but I've rarely seen teams be supportive to an individual and meet all the individuals, both, again, helping them develop professionally and staying in a healthy place to do this work, that can be accomplished in an hour team meeting. Because a lot of team meetings, what I see, even if you do, there's some community-based approach, community meetings, I believe they're called, where you do sort of more of a check-in with people at the beginning of them. But a lot of times these are administrative meetings. What are the announcements? And maybe you do a case presentation. But if you have a team of 15 or 20 people, am I willing, and is there time for me to bring up that I had this really, really difficult interaction and I'm not sure where to put that psychologically? I don't know if I'm dealing with this right. It takes a really strong team for every member to feel comfortable doing that. So I think team supervision is better than nothing. Team reflective supervision is better than just administrative team supervision, but I think we also have to be really honest about the limitations of that. And so if you were to say, put me up against the wall and say, Matt, you've got to be honest here. What do you think supervisory structure for a trauma-informed environment would look like? And I would say at the bare minimum, it's a half hour of individual supervision a week. And that may mean we need to look at the organizational chart a little differently. However, again, I believe the quality gains and even long-term, some of the efficiency because of the proactive problem solving is worth any investment short-term to get there. And I know this is controversial to people. So the thing I liked and why I wanted to do this kind of mini episode, besides I wanted to get some fresh content out there for all our folks, is that I'd love to get your opinions on this. Sometimes I say this and I think I make a pretty good argument for it, and then people just kind of withdraw in themselves because how's a principal going to shift into that environment? How's a medical director going to start all of a sudden supervising physicians who have never been supervised before? So I think there's some really powerful questions. So please, I would love to get your thoughts on this. I'll throw in a few discussion questions as well on here at traumainformedlens.org. I'd love to get your thoughts, because if I get your thoughts, I can integrate them to our next conversation that we'll bring Kurt and Jerry back into. So again, I apologize for just being me today. Hopefully I got you thinking, and in some ways we'll set up the next episode really well, where we can bring in those both Kurt and Jerry's expertise and see where we go with that. So thank you for your patience with us. I apologize again, but visit us at traumainformedlens.org, and the three of us will see you next week. Thanks so much. Bye.